Stanford University.
Well, I want to introduce our morning speaker, Luis Fraga. He is the Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, the Director of the Diversity Research Institute, and the Russell F. Stark University Professor at the University of Washington, and the dad of a Stanford graduate who just graduated a year ago from Stanford, I just learned. So he has a lot of names and a lot of titles on his business card. He's also known to many Knight Fellows as one of their favorite professors at Stanford. He spent 15 years at Stanford as a highly regarded political science professor, and he left for the University of Washington just 2 years ago, and we miss him. He was a favorite Knight seminar leader with always had an inside scoop on how race and politics combine in America. Luis was also on the Knight Fellowships Program Committee, the group that selects U.S. fellows each year, so some of you might have Luis to thank for being here. Luis received his PhD from Rice University. He's a member of the American Political Science Committee and co-author of Democracy at Risk: How Political Choices Undermine Citizen Participation and What We Can Do About It. He's one of 6 principal investigators on a really groundbreaking Latino national survey. It's one of the first 16 state surveys of Latinos in the United States. And that book, the first book from focus groups of the Latino National Survey, is entitled Making It Home, Latino Lives in America, and it's going to be published by Temple University Press. Luis will be talking today, about a topic of interest to a lot of people in the United States, and especially journalists as well, Obama, Sotomayor, and the future of race in America. Luis.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you to Dawn and Jim for the opportunity to be here and spend some time with you. I've been asked to speak for 20 minutes, and then the rest of the time that we have till 10:15, will be for an open discussion and questions and interaction. So I will do my best to keep my comments down to the 20 minutes. And having given talks to groups of Knight Fellows for maybe 5-6 years, the last 5 or 6 years I was here, I know that I'll be lucky if I get through 5 minutes without the first hand going up and someone asking what I really mean by a particular term or question. So please feel free to be yourselves as much as you might like. I thought I'd use 3 questions to talk to you in this brief time to raise a set of questions about how we might better understand the election of President Obama and the more recent nomination of Sonia Sotomayor as a possible Associate Justice to the Supreme Court as a way of thinking about race in America and the future of race in America. And some of what I'll say is not particularly new to you, but I hope to be able to offer you a couple of different twists in the traditional understanding that we have about what this presidential election and Supreme Court nomination mean as a way to generate a discussion and a further set of questions. I have 3 questions that I want to use to talk with you. One, why did so few scholars and even pundits predict Obama in 2008, that we would have an African-American president in 2008? And I would suggest to you as well that it would be the first African-American president who would nominate the first Latina to the Supreme Court. Why do Obama's election and Sotomayor's nomination, what do Obama's election and Sotomayor's nomination help us understand about change and continuity in the role of race and ethnicity in America? To the first question, I want to suggest to you that among the reasons we have so few of us predicted that this would happen 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, it wasn't even on anyone's radar screen, is because of what I'm going to call traditional oppositional binaries that we use to understand race in the United States. What do Obama's and Sotomayor's election help us understand about change and continuity? Here, I want to suggest that the most comprehensive and perhaps insightful, among the most comprehensive and insightful ways to think of what this presidential election and Supreme Court nomination mean, requires us to get away from those oppositional binaries and to think of change and continuity coexisting. And then third and finally, might understandings based upon intersectionality, and by intersectionality I mean the coexistence of patterns of identity and action, at times oppositional patterns of identity and action, the coexistence of oppositional patterns of identity and action in individuals and groups, and simultaneity, a concept that in some ways is completely obvious and that I don't think we very often use. And by simultaneity, I mean the coexistence of distinct and at times oppositional patterns of political development. Of course, we're going to talk about race. Political development with regards to race, the coexistence of oppositional and certainly distinct patterns with regards to political development as it relates to race in the United States, might understandings based upon intersectionality and simultaneity lead us to a more comprehensive understanding of opportunities and collaborative problem solving in the future political development of the United States. And those are the two new ideas that I want to ask you to think about and that I hope we have some opportunity to talk about, but I know you'll talk about whatever it is you would like to talk about because that's your job. Very quickly, the limits of oppositional binaries. Well, we know we have a strong American tradition of thinking in very stark and clear black-white terms. We know the reason that this exists in the United States. It's the way in which slavery was a necessary compromise in order to establish the nation state, the way in which the nation state embraced a clear black-white divide in order to achieve the reconciliation between distinct economic regions and, we might say, cultural regions of the country to be able to unify at a time of great challenge, at a time of the revolution. We see in many different parts of the world the tremendous tragedies that exist with regards to, if you will, group-based divisions that lead to civil war. It's important for us to remember in thinking about our own history of oppositional binaries that we went through exactly the same thing. We had to fight with each other. Brothers had to shoot at each other. Families had to divide with each other in order to deal with the most stark division that we had as part of the origin of our nation at the time of slavery. Reconstruction simply tried to address that, and certainly we know that our pattern of reimposition, if you will, of Jim Crow also replicated that type of binary, oppositional, black-white understanding of the American tradition. When we tried to address it in a more systematic way, building upon the initial progress that occurred during the period of Reconstruction, we adopted a rights-based approach. This was the civil rights movement, and we know that that rights-based approach very much led to, interestingly enough, a reaffirmation of elements of that white-black racial divide. Here it was defined, however, more in terms of exclusion and inclusion. The idea of using the legal system as the primary mechanism, and maybe the only one for trying to overcome that history of division, was one which led to, unfortunately, an understanding of progress, an understanding of political development that was largely rights-based and therefore zero-sum. That is, the extent to which one group advanced was at the extent to which another group lost. We see that reappear in elements of our politics today, and it's why we have charges of reverse discrimination that exist. And then even when we were able to overcome that sense of oppositional binaries and culture wars, able to overcome that sense of division based upon race, tried to overcome it in terms of a rights-based approach, maybe when race was minimized, the country was very comfortable immediately adopting what I would call, and other scholars have called, race-coded language, whether in the fashion of culture wars, but distinct segments of the population were defined as worthy or unworthy. Terms like big government and big taxes, terms like a targeted war on drugs, terms like the resulting consequences of the prison industrial complex, I suggest to you we're still very much defined along that sense of oppositional binaries. The point that I'm trying to suggest to you is that that sort of a history made it very difficult for us to predict that we might ever have, as a viable candidate for President of the United States, someone like Barack Obama. it made it very difficult as well for a candidate like Barack Obama to try to come in with a new racial discourse, which in fact he tried to do. And if one thinks of the early part of his campaign, certainly I would say at least until the Reverend Wright concerns appeared, many of you and many of us were very comfortable understanding his candidacy as an example of a transracial campaign. He wasn't running merely as an ethnic candidate, as a racial candidate. He was running as somehow a candidate who was, if not above those sorts of divisions, one who aspired for the country and developed a campaign and a platform that did not largely focus on race and racial division and racial inclusion as a part of his campaign. He talked about an inclusive America, but it was always an inclusive America that included everyone. If you will, the change that we saw and that many of us understood to occur in the course of the early part of his campaign was a change that I want to suggest to you was consistent with, very consistent with, the earlier oppositional binary understandings. Somehow we were leaving our past behind, and now we were coming to a new sense of forward progress and a new sense of opportunity, his word, hope, a new sense of opportunity and hope that his campaign presented. But we all know that the continuity in his campaign, when the examples of Reverend Wright's comments and sermons appeared, we all know that very quickly his campaign was caught into the traditional oppositional binary. When Reverend Wright's sermon was circulated on YouTube and other places, and especially when the media picked up on this, once again his candidacy became a very clear race-bound candidacy, and he had to justify himself in racial terms, and there were great questions about whether he would be successful in justifying himself in racial terms that allowed him to maintain his credibility as trying to transcend, if you will, the traditional understandings of the racial divide. Now, what we know from the president's biography himself is that the sense of oppositional binaries was something that he had dealt with all of his life. And we know certainly from his biography that his own evolution to his understanding of himself as an African American, as a black person in the United States, took time, and that he went through a variety of periods of understanding in his own life. As a young person, certainly as a college student, even as a law student, and he came to an understanding based upon an active search, if you will, of what position he held and people like him held in our society. And what became very apparent was that it was complex, and we see that complexity in the nature of the speech that he gave, the tremendous speech that he gave to respond to the criticisms made with regards to the speech given by Reverend Wright. I won't read to you from that speech because I think we're all familiar with it, but let me just take 2 sentences and in fact read to you. I should come clean. In college, I worked part-time for the Boston Globe. You all remember the Boston Globe? I'm just teasing. Doing 45-minute telephone surveys for the Boston Globe on political issues. This was a new enterprise that they were going to do in the mid-1970s. How do you keep someone on the phone for 45 minutes when you're doing a set of explicit political interviews and you're interviewing them on the phone when they don't want to talk to you for 45 minutes on the phone? You start out by saying, I have a few questions to ask you about politics. And they say, okay. And they say, how long will this take? And you say, well, it's just a few questions. And then you get through your first 15, and you've got about 45 questions to go, and the person stops you and says, I thought you said that this was just a few questions, and you say, oh, yes, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. I just have a few more questions. And And then when the baby has jumped out of the tub and grandmother has fallen down the stairway, and the person absolutely has to get off the phone, you say, you're absolutely right, I'm very sorry, I just have a few more questions. And then you keep them on the phone. And then when ultimately they hang up on you, and you then call them back, and you say, hello, I know we talked before, and I want to complete the survey because I'm a college student and I don't get paid unless I have completed interviews. And of course the person then says, well, how long will that take? And you say, it's just a few more questions. So I just want to let you know when I say that I'm not going to read that I may actually read a little bit from it. But among the things he said was, the fact is that the comments that have been made, and this was toward the end of his speech, the fact is that the comments that have been made and the issues that have surfaced over the last few weeks reflect the complexities of race in this country that we've never really worked through, a part of our union that we have not yet made perfect. You know, perfect union was part of his organizing theme. Then he said, and if we walk away now, if we simply retreat into our respective corners, we will never be able to come together and solve problems like healthcare or education or the need to find good jobs for every American. What President Obama did in that speech, and what I think it's best to understand, to learn from his example in that speech, was that he was a clear personification of both that history of oppositional binaries and capacity to transcend them. But to do that required a greater appreciation of complexity, and he, interestingly enough, in his own individual person, personified that complexity. Yes, his biracial heritage, but more important than his biracial heritage was, I think, the evolutionary path that his own life took to come to a substantial understanding of himself as an African American in American society. Now, what's interesting about understanding Obama as a transcending candidate is that when one looks at his election, it was one of the most polarized elections in the history of the United States. African Americans, who increased their percent of the overall national electorate in that election by 3% to now comprise about 13%, 95% voted for President Obama. This is consistent across all states. Little variation here and there. The national, this is according to our not fully scientific, but reasonably representative exit polls. Latinos, which we'll talk about in just a minute with regards to Judge Sotomayor, even a little further, who increased their percent of the national electorate by 4%, now comprising an estimated 9%, voted for Obama at 67%, roughly the traditional levels, if you will, that Latinos tend to support Democratic candidates. Bush was a bit of an anomaly. We can talk about that a little bit later in the question and answer period. Asian Americans supported Obama by 62%, but Caucasians, who declined by an estimated 8% of the overall national electorate because of these increases, 4 plus 3 plus 1 minus 8, only supported Obama by 43%. Interestingly, it was an increase of only 2% over the 41% of white voters who supported John Kerry 4 years earlier. So there wasn't any tremendous shift, if you will, at least nationally, there wasn't any tremendous shift that demonstrated a clear transcending, if you will, of the racial divide. And in fact, in some of our, if you will, traditional southern states, the vote polarization was even more significant. 76% of whites in Georgia, for example, voted for John McCain. 88% of whites voted for John McCain in the state of Mississippi. In North Carolina, the numbers dropped to 64%. In Florida, the numbers dropped even further to 56%. So there is some substantial variation across the country, but an overall pattern, I think it would be fair to say, was still very clear. And I think it might even be important for us to understand that this pattern of vote polarization that I'm referring to here, in part, was largely responsible for the success that the Obama campaign had in putting together necessary winning coalitions in a number of different states. So, for example, that's a little loud. So, for example, if you look at the nationwide vote, and here what we have is not only the percent distribution of the white vote, the African-American vote, the Asian vote, and the Latino vote. The Latino vote is the red on top, African-American vote here, Asian vote here. Excuse me for the use of the colors to be consistent with certain traditions. What you can see here is that it was, if you will, the minority vote, the vote of color, that at least nationally gave President Obama the capacity to have a majority of nationwide votes cast. This is that split that I was referring to earlier in the white vote. By one estimate, 90% of all the voters who supported Senator McCain were white, as compared to the much more diverse coalition put together by President Obama. In key states like New Mexico, you can see how the Latino vote was critical to him winning that state. He lost the white vote in that state. You can see in a state like Florida that the combination of the African-American vote and the fact that Obama won the Latino vote in Florida, he won it by an estimated 57 to 42%. You can see that there very clearly, this critical state, this state that is etched permanently in our memory, that this state is very important. Just to go along more quickly, in Nevada, a very interesting state, you can see again how it was the combination of African American and Latino votes that swung that important state for the president. You can take the state of Colorado, you find a similar pattern. What I'm trying to suggest to you here is that there's an important way in which race transcendence, to the extent that it exists, coexists with elements of a traditional racial ethnic divide that helps us best understand, perhaps, the sort of success that President Obama was able to attain. Now, what is this? Oh, that's one other state, California. Sorry, here he won the white vote, but what's interesting about California is that you can see that the Republican support given by Asian, African American, and Latino voters, interestingly enough, makes the vote of Democrats of color, if you will, makes their vote even more critical. And if you compare this to 2004, you can see how in Nevada, for example, by one estimate of exit polls in 2004, it was a Latino vote that swung that state for President Bush. Not that he won a majority of those votes, but in combination with the white vote that he received, it becomes extremely significant. Now, what does this have to do with Sotomayor? And the pattern that I'm trying to get you to see from the discussion of President Obama, again, is changing continuity. Very quickly, what do we see from Sotomayor? Well, there is an example of change in this Supreme Court nominee. She is opinion-rich and ultra-qualified. That's a new pattern for a Supreme Court justice. Not that they're ultra-qualified. Well, actually, in fact, that they are ultra-qualified. I believe she is, I'm forgetting the exact date that appears in the press, but in terms of her judicial experience, she is among the most experienced jurists ever to be nominated to the Supreme Court. When you combine her experience at the district court level and at the circuit court level, I was mentioning to one of you yesterday, I would even argue that the most substantial part of her jurist's experience occurred when she was an assistant prosecutor in the district attorney's office in the city of New York, because as all of you know, it is prosecutors who actually distribute the greatest amounts of justice and injustice in our system in deciding who to prosecute and what to prosecute them for. So she's been intimately involved in elements of the difficult decision-making about what justice is and what it is not for a long part of her life, and opinion-rich in that there's a whole lot there. And the previous pattern was you nominated, but particularly since Robert Bork, you nominated Supreme Court. You had Supreme Court nominees who didn't have a whole lot in writing that people could latch onto. Well, she likes to write. She does write questions about how impressive the writing is or how flowery the writing is. Circuit court judges don't write flowery terms. That's not their job. Appellate court judges are required to issue opinions that are very specific to the law. They are very detail intensive. They're very footnote heavy, and that's the sort of writing that she has. Ultra qualified in terms of her life story, her upward mobility, and so forth. That's a different sort of candidate than we've tended to have in the past. The continuity is, of course, that she's an affirmative action candidate. And this is an attempt, if you will, to take a major change and put it into that oppositional binary. And this is the position that Newt Gingrich and others, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, and Fox News, and many others have taken to try to critique her particular position. The charge that she's a reversed racist, the charge that the National Council of La Raza that she was affiliated with, interestingly, in some circles, the organization is referred to as La Raza. When the actual name is National Council in English, National Council of La Raza. But when you say La Raza, it sounds like something else, which to me is rather interesting. At one point, even being referred to by one pundit as the Latino KKK without the hoods, as a way of trying to affect elements of our national conscience. But the Ritchie versus DeStefano case, I think, made her even more clearly identified, perhaps with some greater legitimacy, as a potential affirmative action candidate. And clearly, what Sotomayor's life story suggests to us is that she's both. She's both an example of someone who is distinct from many previous individuals who have been nominated to the Supreme Court, and there's a distinct strategy that the Obama administration is using in nominating her to the court, but she is also simultaneously an affirmative action candidate. She's the first Latina who's there. And the president only considered women as finalists for the position on the Supreme Court. And her own life story is a life story of coming to terms with opportunities to use her identity as a way of trying to advance within traditional systems of power and influence, particularly within the legal system. Anticipating the Senate hearings, well, we're all familiar with the Republican dilemma. The Republican dilemma is very much related to the previous slide that I showed you regarding Latinos and Latino voters, and a lot of comments are made that you read in the press about the importance of Latino voters. Well, when you look at the data, like the data I presented there, which I assure you the Republican Party is very familiar with, there is that dilemma that the Republican Party faces, but of course it faces the dilemma as well of needing to appeal to its traditional base of support. That's why a number of people are doing that. Less talked about is the Democratic dilemma. And the Democratic dilemma is the extent to which this nomination might in fact be used in subsequent electoral campaigns, not to derail her nomination, but in subsequent electoral campaigns as an example of gross ethnic pandering that might threaten the extent to which important moderate white voters are critical components of Democratic constituencies, particularly in competitive districts in the Senate and especially in the House of Representatives. Now, there's one other fact that I think her nomination requires us to consider and think about a little carefully, and then I've got just one more slide and then I'll be done, because I've reached my 20-minute limit, and in fact, for those of you who are counting, I've gone over by 5 already. So I really only have one more slide. We'll see if you believe that. But I really only have one more slide after this one. One more slide after this one. One of the interesting questions that has come up and that the Sotomayor nomination brings up is the issue of Latino pan-ethnic identity. The extent to which a Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx, and we all know that there are Puerto Ricans and then there are Puerto Ricans, and then there are Puerto Ricans from the South Bronx who are even different from other Puerto Ricans, was the extent to which she would be embraced by or be effectively supported by a broad cross-section of Latinos and Latino leaders across the country. And this is based upon our Latino National Survey, which, as Dawn said, was the first ever 16-state stratified survey of Latinos in the United States, a sample of 8,624 respondents, state representative samples to allow us to compare Texas to California to Illinois, to compare by national origin group, to compare by 4 generations, to compare by language ability, all these different ways in which one might compare, to try to have a rich data set to try to understand what this community is. Among the most interesting findings we have so far is the extent to which Latinos, in fact, if you look at this all category here, Latinos simultaneously identify as pan-ethnic at the highest levels, 87.2%, and by their national origin group, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican, Salvadorian, Ecuadorian, Colombian, and all of the subsets of those, and simultaneously identify by 65%. These are the same people. Identify by 65% as Americans, giving you a sense of strong pan-ethnic identity that I think her nomination has been able to benefit from, but also demonstrating that that strong sense of pan-ethnic identity is not at the cost of national origin identity and coincides with very high levels of identification. The question that's asked is, how strongly do you identify as an American? Separate question, how strongly do you identify with your national origin group? How strongly do you identify as a Latino or Hispanic, choosing the term that the person initially wanted them offered to us to use? These are the percents answering very strongly or somewhat strongly. These identities tend to coincide. They're not subtractive. They're additive, suggesting as well an additional level of complexity in understanding the nature of the continuing changes that occur regarding racial and ethnic identity in the United States. This really is the last slide. So finally, what am I trying to get across? Well, one is, I think we have to think, what these two examples help us do is to consider the possibility that the old binaries don't work very cleanly anymore, if they ever did. You know, there have always been racial complexities in the country, relating to mixed race families, mixed race identities. Some people, I would argue, make a little too much of that. The most recent Census Bureau said that about 3.4% of Americans identify as multiracial. It's still a relatively small percent of our nation, but the intermingling, if you will, of races has been something that has always existed in the United States. But intersectionality, recall that I said intersectionality in terms of the coexistence of patterns of sometimes oppositional identity, individual identity, and group identity, the coexistence of those identities that have implications for action. The presence of intersectionality is, I think, something that increasingly characterizes the way in which we understand ourselves in the United States and the way in which we all need to understand race in the United States. I suggest to you that among the reasons that the old racial binaries can sometimes be brought up, even as applied to individuals who are so intersectional, as Obama or Sotomayor, that the reason that they can be brought up, Sotomayor is the best example here, right? What's the controversial comment that she made in her speech at Berkeley? That she would hope that a Latina woman with the wisdom of her experience would make better decisions, wiser decisions. I've got the exact quote here, if you want to hear it. What is not stated is what she said subsequently in that speech, which was, and I therefore check my views to make sure that I am as careful to not make decisions solely on the basis of that identity. So an acknowledgement, if you will, of perspective to try to overcome it. I think the reason we can so easily fall back into the binary argument about she therefore is not able to be objective is because for her logic to be applied to many of us, particularly to those of us who are white, requires us to acknowledge our positions of white privilege and the way in which white privilege might bias our capacities, or challenge, rather, our capacities for objectivity, and that's what folks don't want to talk about. because to accept her perspective or to accept President Obama's perspective of being multiracial requires all of us to take a very strong and significant and deep look in the mirror to identify what our prejudices might be, and for our society to take a similar sort of look. We also have to begin to think of the counterintuitive consequences of simultaneity. Remember, simultaneity was the coexistence of distinct patterns of American political development. One of the reasons Obama and Sotomayor can have the attractiveness that they do, I'm now 11 minutes over, for those of you who are counting. One of the reasons they can have the attractiveness that they do, that their life stories can have the compelling impact that they have on us, one of the reasons for that is because so many other African Americans and Latinos do not have that same life story. That is, with opportunities for individual upward mobility, which I think it's difficult for us to deny, that racial minorities now have more opportunities for individual mobility than ever before, that coexists with traditional patterns of challenge and downward mobility. And is it possible that the reason someone like Obama or Sotomayor can be so attractive as a sign of the hope of our country is only because not that many people have their qualifications and experiences who are African American or, in Sotomayor's case, Latina. That is, what makes them attractive to a majority of us is in fact their distinctiveness from their racial communities of origin. Might individual upward mobility be mutually reinforced and possible only because of continuing patterns of downward mobility among substantial segments of our population? We don't have to look too far to find that. High school graduation rates for African Americans are estimated now at about 55%. Today, 55%. For Latinos, 51%. For whites, interestingly enough, the figure that's never talked about, only, I would argue only, 71%. 29% of our white students never graduate from high school, according to some of our best data. These simultaneous patterns of political development, advancement and lack of advancement, coexist and maybe mutually reinforce each other. My last comment, maybe it's that balance of change and continuity that we need to begin to think about. Not whether we are on a new path toward upward mobility, but what the balance is between the change and continuity, the upward mobility and the downward mobility that coexist. There actually is one more slide. I lied. But it's a quick one. These are the Census Bureau estimates of the changing, this really is the last one. The changing, and if you believe me, the changing demographics in the country. This is projections out. These numbers, of course, will be modified based upon the new census, 10 years up to 2050, and then having some fun speculating out. Demographers would never do this. This is just for fun. This is not for demographic accuracy. But if the general pattern holds, although the specific numbers may not, you can see that there's a decline in the Caucasian population that is going to occur. 2050 is going to be a particularly significant year. Some people are now putting it at 2040 when a majority of Americans in the country will not identify as Caucasian. And it's not that more multiracial folks will appear at this point. It's that the age distribution of whites, the aging, if you will, of the Caucasian population, the increasing growth of the Latino population, increasing growth of the Asian population, and stability of the African American population this is based upon straight line assumptions of current immigration rates, current birth rates, and current death rates. You can see that the country is changing to maybe have a quarter of Latinos when it has about 13% African Americans and 9% Asians, and maybe in 100 years be a very different country than before. The balance between change and continuity is whether this is a sign of our country splitting apart or a sign actually, as these lines suggest, of our country coming together and talking more in terms of interwoven destinies, of linked fate, of ways in which different segments of our community that we've traditionally understood as separate actually have responsibility and opportunity to contribute to each other's progress, rather than to see ourselves as constantly in combination. What gives me hope is in fact the personal stories of someone like Barack Obama and Sonia Sotomayor. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for mentioning the comments that Sotomayor made at Berkeley. I also thought it was very interesting that so many conservative pundits in the media, mostly who had a lot of white privilege, called her a racist. There was quite a lot of that. But I wanted to go back to one of your slides where you said that a majority of Latinos identified as American. And I wonder about this question I think we have in this country about owning that word Americans. Like, if you're from the United States, you're an American, versus, I think people in Latin America, I don't know the figure, and Central America, who they identify as American, not necessarily as USers, as some have said. So can you comment about that?
We positioned to get over that problem. Now, our survey was a survey that was in English and Spanish, and the respondent decided, which all of our interviewers were bilingual, made for very interesting technical challenges as to how to do that. But we wanted to be very sensitive to Spanish language use. 65% of all Latinos currently in the United States were born in another country, come from Latin America, somewhere in Latin America. That coexists with 85, according to the Census Bureau, about 85.7% of all Latinos under the age of 18 who were born in the United States. So you get this interesting split between the youth and between the adults. There is a tradition of, in Latin America, of some people using American to refer to themselves as well in terms of the broader sense of America. We consciously positioned these questions about 2/3 of the way through the survey, where we, in previous questions, very clearly indicated that when we were talking about American, we were talking about the United States. And we asked them to compare themselves, to compare their experiences to what other Americans in the United States experience and so forth. So we don't worry too much about, we don't have reason right now to worry. We also find that these patterns of identification, they're lower here for American than any, and they're lowest among the first generation, and that's what we would expect, because they haven't been in the country here for very long. What we find, interestingly, is that within 7 to 10 years, there begins to be a new pattern of very strong identification with the United States. 7 years seems to be a kind of a magical period that applies to partisanship, applies to identification as an American, applies to adopting a set of traditional values that are associated with, some would say, traditional American values. There is an interesting way in which that works itself out. Yes.
Hi. You started with a question which was about the pundits, and I think you were getting at this: why did we miss what was going to happen here? But if you look at your numbers, right, 43% of white people were voting for Obama, and of course, our pundits and press are unfortunately mostly white people, so that's who they're surrounded with. I'm a little perplexed by what you were saying, both in terms of the Civil War had to happen to get to where we are politically. Downward mobility has to happen for this upward mobility, and maybe I'm confused about that. And finally, I'll ask this one, and then I can listen to the whole answer. But as one who had the privilege of getting assigned to the Palin campaign this season, I wanted to hear more about how the Republicans were involved in this transracial campaign, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. At least the Republicans didn't think it happened in a vacuum, that Obama had to position himself in a certain way.
Two responses. One, the coexistence that I'm trying to talk about, the simultaneity that I'm talking about, is the following. And it's a very old American pattern. With regards to African Americans and others, it was the distinction between the good ones and the bad ones, or the house slaves and the field slaves. There's a way in which I think in our American conscience, many of us become enchanted with the life experiences that are exceptions to the general patterns that we know exist. And it allows us, interestingly enough, as a society overall, And it's not just for whites. It's for all of us, I would suggest. It allows us to be very comfortable praising and if our values are consistent, supporting a candidate whose life experiences are distinct, and not doing a thing to push public policy to actually restructure opportunity for those who are not able to experience that upward mobility. So in a sense, the transracial logic and transracial coalition, multiracial coalition, right, gets part of its power from the fact that so little progress is made for so many others. It's a different way of thinking about it. So that's my response to that question. Now, on the question of what were the Republicans doing in Palin, you know, and this came out. This came out in the press. My wife, 8-year-old son, and I happened to, since we were in Seattle now, go on an Alaska cruise last summer, and I will never forgive the Republican Party for destroying my fantasy of Alaska in the course of this campaign. The reason, and no one talks about this that I know of. If I'm wrong, please correct me. The reason that Obama could think in transracial terms and could have that magnificent speech that he did, right? And the reason that I think many of us could hear it, this is going to be controversial, it's because of George Bush. President Bush, in his 2000 campaign, did something that no presidential candidate had ever done before. He made his relationship to Latinos and Latino voters a central part, not just of an ethnic campaign and ethnic appeal. That had been happening, you know, for a while, certainly at least since President Kennedy's Viva Kennedy campaign clubs. Richard Nixon had his Hispanic strategy in 1972. You know, that had occurred. You know, Amigos de Bush. You know, and so forth. Right? But what the some call that Benditos de Bush, but that's a separate issue. Sorry, I'm not one of those who said that, but there's some who did. What he did in 2000 that was different, and I think incredible, and it took the Democrats 8 years to learn from this, and there is, I think, some evidence for this. He made his relationship to Latino voters a part of how he wanted all voters in the country to understand who he was. Was it genuine or not? Was it sincere? How do you reconcile that with compassionate conservatism? We can argue. The fact that he was very comfortable saying, I come from this state, I have these constituents, I'm proud to speak Spanish. We can argue how good his Spanish was. The easy, comment here, it was far better than his English, but his Spanish was not insignificant. And in fact, when he gave an interview prior to his campaign, where he was asked, because it was in his inaugural address in Texas, his second inaugural address for governor, where he spoke Spanish. And a reporter asked him the question. I saw this interview and I said, boy, the Democrats are in trouble. Said, didn't you worry about making a mistake in speaking Spanish? And he says, well, I don't speak it perfectly, but I do the best I can. He said, you're missing the point. The point is that someone like me, governor of a state, what's important is not how well I speak it. What's important is that I try and that I do it in public. I'd never heard a Democrat say that. I've never heard a Democrat personalize that. So I think the success that the Bush campaign had with Latino voters in 2000 and in 2004 that clearly could not be sustained, it's what the McCain-Palin campaign missed. And interestingly enough, the ideal candidate, I wrote that and published that, the ideal candidate to do that was someone like John McCain, who had been so much at the front of attempts at meaningful, comprehensive immigration reform. They made a judgment, I have to assume, I haven't interviewed the folks, maybe you have. They made a judgment that that was too high a risk to take with their base. And therefore, they had to mobilize their base if there was going to be any way that they would have some chance at competitiveness in key swing states. And they missed that opportunity. When Governor Palin started to talk very much in oppositional binary terms, our America, their America, we Americans, and those over there, I knew that, to me, that was an indication that they had lost the lessons that they had taught the Democratic campaign. Last point. The reason I say the Democratic campaign took 8 years to learn this is because there is clear criticism documented of the Gore and Kerry campaigns that they didn't know how to deal with the issue of race, and much less with the issue of Latino voters, other than as a traditional ethnic racial pandering of the vote during the time of the election. And Obama, I think, fell into that trap at the beginning of his campaign, but was very quickly able to overcome it because of the way he could talk about the personalization of his own understanding of racial issues in this country. Yes?
I wanted to ask you, since the rights-based approach that you said this country adopted post-Reconstruction, since that has now led to calls of reverse discrimination, we've had the Supreme Court rulings, not just Ritchie, but also the Michigan case, the Seattle School District case. How do we talk about diversity and inclusion? Because as you pointed out, Judge Sotomayor and President Obama are exceptions. So we are not there yet. So how do we talk about getting there, but how do we talk about it in a way that I guess is not the traditional paradigms?
In 2004, I published an essay where I tried to begin to do this, and I said, well, we need to go back to move forward. There is a tradition in this country of thinking in terms of the broader public interest and the common interest. In Madison, Federalist Number 10, he talks about the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Hamilton talked about the deliberate sense of community. De Tocqueville talks about self-interest properly understood. I said, if we're going to be able to overcome the limits of a rights-based approach, and please don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that the civil rights movement was wrong. I'm saying that the civil rights movement and its strategy, which they were forced to pursue because they couldn't engage, society would not let them engage in the larger public discourse, I would argue, that the strategy they had to choose would lead to the identification of automatic enemies who wanted to overturn the reverse discrimination argument, right? That a way to start overcoming that is to go back to talking about the public interest, interwoven destinies, and linked fate. That is, we have to start thinking about what I termed an informed public interest. So we need to have leaders, particularly leaders of ethnic, racial, and other working class communities. We need to have them engage directly in debates and arguments about what's in the best interest of the country, and not just what's in the best interests of my group. Because as limited as we are in the power of majorities to make final decisions, majoritarianism still is an important principle of how we make decisions. Unless you, and the president is experiencing this every day, right? Unless we have a system of, which we don't have, a system where you have one total ruler who can decide, you've always got to build coalition partners. Well, who has the greatest responsibility for building coalition partners? Those who want, in public policy, those who want to serve those interests and those communities that currently do not benefit very much from that public policy. How do you do that? You got to build coalition partners. How do you build coalition partners? Well, you can do it by appeals to conscience. Those don't work or last. It's the other lesson of the civil rights movement. Appeals to conscience, when they directly confront competition and self-interest, lose a lot of their power. They still work for some of us, but they lose a lot of their power. You have to talk about mutual self-interest. And you've got to demonstrate in studies and evidence about mutual self-interest. And that's, I think, a way in which that debate can try to move forward. I think this administration gets it. And if you look at the president's language, it's filled with language about what we share, what we have in common, the need to move forward, the need to be able to advance everyone and all interests in society. Healthcare reform is going to be a magnificent example of that. I mean, why think about healthcare reform now? Because businesses can't compete internationally with healthcare costs. It required private sector interests, right? It required private sector interests saying, we have a common interest, got excited. We have a common interest with those who don't have any health insurance coverage. in order to be able to advance. That's the opportunity for coalition that is. We'll see if we're mature enough to handle it. Sorry, Andrea.
I have just a couple questions. The first question is, I think I heard you say that Kerry got 41% of the white vote and Obama got 43. Did I hear that right? So that would seem to argue that the country was much less racially polarized.
Who does?
In the Obama election. No?
No.
You don't think?
That's my point.
He got more percentage of the white vote than Kerry, right?
That's right, but only 2. Where he got noticeable increases is among the Latino vote, and interestingly enough, in the African-American vote. So those 2 things are coinciding. And you got an exacerbation of the polarization in many southern states. Not all, but in many southern states.
But if the country was really extremely racially polarized, wouldn't you have had Obama losing points over Kerry among white voters?
Depends on where you look, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at, right? Did Obama put together a new multiracial coalition? Sure, in Virginia and in North Carolina and in Florida, than he did in many other places. Did that characterize the whole country? Much less so. Did that all happen to coincide with an exacerbation of polarization in certain states in the South? Yeah, all of those things are happening at the same time. That's the point I'm trying to make.
But I noticed that in your talk, and I'm sort of curious about what you think the effect is, you didn't talk about the economy, which to me, I mean, I was out talking to voters in all those places you just said for most of the fall. And my sense is that people's attitudes about the fact that Obama was not white changed drastically after collapse of Lehman, you know, the whole AIG, that all of a sudden people, I mean, there were a lot of things obviously that went into it, but that I ran into a lot of white voters in swing states that seemed surprised by the fact that they were going to vote for the black man. And so I'm wondering whether that is about the particular circumstances, or did people's racial attitudes change?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. I'm curious if you've seen anything that would suggest one way or the other.
As a scholar, I have to say I do know the answer. Whatever the truth actually is. I would ask you to think about the following, and that's consistent with my argument, I think. It took the greatest economic disaster this country has faced since the Great Depression for an African-American candidate to be competitive. A clear pattern of economic downturn was what gave him not a guaranteed chance, a competitive chance to maybe be that candidate of the opposition party. Good fortune comes in here. It was a Republican administration before, not a Democrat one, so he didn't have that legacy to try to overcome. I have in a talk used the example of the following on this point. Is it appropriate to understand Obama as following the pattern of African American mayors in central cities? African Americans became mayors of many central cities at a time when those cities' economies collapsed. And it led to a substantial amount of white outmigration. And African American voters, therefore, were able to be a majority of the voters in important and significant cities as a result of that. But what many of those mayors found is that once they were in positions of power, and some of them over time even had majority governing coalitions of fellow African Americans, Chicago for a period of time with Latino elected officials as well, they found themselves tremendously constrained in their ability to pursue a set of public policies because of the economic vulnerability of cities, but particularly because of the collapse of the economy that existed. Is Obama following that same pattern? Is he the mayor of a central city? And is one of the reasons he was able to get elected the fact that our economy tanked, and therefore there was an opportunity for a set of interests to be put together that might be different than what we would previously expect. What I like about that question is not only that I came up with a framing, but But we'll know the answer. We'll know the answer in 3 years or in 7 years. I mean, we'll know how well he's been able to do, how the public will respond, what the opposition, what the Republican Party will put together as a potential competitor. So we'll be in a position to better assess whether his example, again, is an exception that proves the rule or a sign of new progress for the country.
I just wanted to ask you about the last slide that you had up there. I think it was your last slide. The one, yeah, that one. And this is prompted in part by the fact that I live in the Bronx, but I'd like you to look into the future based on today, because that future picture to me is incredibly interesting. So my question is, we have congressional districts today which are dominated by Latinos, and in the Bronx is an example of it, and Ruben Diaz Jr. and those, a leader in our community. So I'm wondering, if you look at communities today that are Latino dominated with Latino leadership, can we predict what the future might be in 100 years, looking at a political scene where you would have that kind of change in demographics? Because the future picture, which I'm interested, might be evolving today in those kinds of districts, if you could talk about that.
Well, there's no question that the demographic change has led to an increased election of representatives of concentrations of that demographic change, and the two have to coincide. It's not just population growth, it's population growth that's sufficiently geographically concentrated so that a majority of the electorate, if it chooses to vote together, can in fact then elect someone who might be different than was elected in the past. So a great deal depends upon how much residential integration we have in the future growth. You know, these are population numbers, right? What are the patterns of upward mobility of these populations? And what are the patterns of related residential mobility that this population growth will lead to? If the residential mobility is still limited and the upward mobility is still limited, our history would suggest that we're going to get increasing concentrations in pockets of great economic challenge, right? So these representatives are going to be representatives there's going to be more and more of these representatives, but representing basically disempowered communities. And so will they be in a position, if their numbers grow, to transform the nature of our public policy? Well, that's this challenge of the public interest. Right? One of the ways in which historically we know the U.S. responds, we respond to upward mobility based upon class and race and ethnicity is for upper class status and the value of property to become more and more exclusive. Now that's under the automobile industry, right? You could do that under the automobile industry. When you have challenges regarding fuel and challenges regarding policy related to the consumption of fuel, that becomes more difficult. So you could get increased residential density. If we don't do that, then this exclusionary pattern to population shifts and growth, right? If that exclusionary pattern is maintained, we still have the sorts of challenges that you're talking about. There should be more officials. What's interesting to me is whether or not there's going to be a transformation, as I was suggesting, in the policy logic that they use to make arguments to try to benefit their constituencies. That's the key challenge, and that's where I think the greatest challenge is for all of us, to try to think about whether or not progress has been attained. Thank you very much, everyone.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.